Now, last week's Epidemic Response Committee meeting on the economy and trade, chaired by Simon Bridges, brought members from the New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, trade negotiators and, of course, politicians from across the House to hear plans for economic development for New Zealand post-COVID-19. To be honest, watching it, Phil Twyford, our Economic Development Minister, didn't really sort of set my world on fire, and I didn't really believe that he knew what was really going on in terms of trade in our economy. You know, that's his portfolio. So I wanted to actually bring your thoughts from across the House to Finance Spokesman for National Party, Paul Goldsmith, who joins us now. And I'd like your comments on the live video feed, of course, of your questions that I can put as well to Paul. Good evening, Paul. Firstly, what do you make of another week for New Zealand at level 4 and the hamstring on the economy of the conditions that are quite strict under level 3, of course, for small business?
Oh, look, I'm very disappointed, and I think many New Zealanders are disappointed. The reality is that Australia and New Zealand, both isolated countries with small populations, sparse population, have been able to do pretty well in getting the COVID-19 under control, and have had very similar health outcomes. But the Australians, of course, have shut down far less of their economy. They've carried on doing construction. A lot of retail and a whole lot of stuff has continued to happen that's been locked down here in New Zealand. And so, you know, I think we should be following the Australian pattern, but instead we're hanging on another week before going into level 3, which in itself is pretty tough as well. So I think we really are dragging it much longer than we needed to, primarily because the government hasn't done its work on testing and tracing.
Okay, so I want to first mention Chris Finney, one of New Zealand's most experienced trade negotiators, comments. He had the opening address there in that committee meeting. He said, trade won't save us, but it will lessen the blow. How important is re-establishing local value-added manufacturing?
Oh, well, it's critical. We're going to have had a real impact on the tourism sector for a long time, and so that's one of our biggest export dollar earners. And so the rest of the export sector, our primary services, and primary sector areas, and the value-added side of that, our manufacturing, all critical to get up and running as fast as we can. And you've got to remember we're in a competitive world as well. If we're not back in global markets, our competitors will be, and so we've got to move fast. There's no time to muck around. Every day makes a big difference. That's why I think government needs to be agile and fast and moving as quickly as we can.
Yeah, actually, I want to talk about Shane Jones's call to ban log exports, 17,000 jobs and $2 billion of local economy that we're missing out, not to mention, as you just said, that there's other countries around the world that are looking to flat out fill our space globally. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that was just one of the typical rambles from Shane Jones and David Parker. I think squashed that idea. But look, any successful economy does lots of things, and we can't close off any more areas than have already been closed off, such as tourism. We need to be as open and as encouraging of enterprise as we possibly can in order to make a living. Just remembering, of course, that there's huge well-being consequences for not having jobs and for seeing your livelihoods destroyed, and we need to be paying much more attention to that.
Yeah, on that, we're speaking to Mike Peterson up next on Zera's Country, Paul. And one thing I want your thoughts on that he's heavily involved in is, of course, reforms. Do you think our trade minister understands the economic impact of his RMA and environment reforms as being the environment minister on what the wider group that was in that committee meeting all wanted to celebrate the prize pony of the food and beverage industry?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reality is that the primary sector has come to New Zealand's rescue again, and we rely on that incredibly successful and globally competitive sector And I just want to reiterate, I'm a townie, but my mother's family are all cockies from the Waikato, and I certainly know and appreciate the enormous effort made throughout the countryside to bring us the export dollars that and that should be valued. And I think the important thing for this government is to recognise that they were very much in the mindset for the first 2 years of just adding cost to business and the primary sector, and everybody just pile it on for whatever reason, just thinking that somehow everybody will cope. They do need to rethink that now, and as a minimum, just put things off for a year or two to give people a chance to take stock, rebuild, and get the economy back together. Just can't keep on piling on more regulation and costs right now. In fact, quite the reverse.
Yeah, well, over the weekend in my circles, we sort of sit there and try and predict the world, as you do, Paul, and there is a real sense of fear out there in our sector that the government are going to be looking with quite beady eyes at anything that actually makes any money through taxes, and of course capital gains tax potentially being back on the table, let alone, as we were saying, the prize exports that we're going to rely on so heavily. So, as we're going into an election campaign, and yourself as spokesman for and potential finance minister, how do we capture the revenue that we need for our government books to repay this debt, yet at the same time don't cripple the hand that feeds us?
Yeah, well, the good news is that over a number of decades now, New Zealand successive governments have been reasonably disciplined around debt. We certainly spent up big during the global financial crisis and to get Canterbury back on track, but then we've already sort of brought that debt down. So, I think we can manage. The critical thing is to get the economy back growing and being productive, and asking that basic question: well, what do we need to do to ensure that New Zealand comes out winning in the post-COVID global world? And fundamentally, that's about being competitive, internationally competitive, and first and foremost, it's about private sector investment and creating an environment where people feel confident to invest, take on new jobs, new risks, start new ventures, come up with new things to export. It's all about private sector decisions. It's not some committee of bureaucrats or officials in Wellington aren't going to decide what's going to be the successful things for the New Zealand economy over the next couple of years. It's individuals making those decisions. But the government can usefully invest in good quality infrastructure and in things that make it easier for our productive sector to be productive, which is helping them move stuff around, having access to great skills, and workers, and good technology. I think most people recognise what an incredible thing the previous national government did in terms of the ultra-fast broadband around the country, which has made our lives a lot more bearable in lockdown than they otherwise would have been.
Yeah, so I've just going to close here, though, the interaction from the audience. Michael Ross, I hope, Michael, that there was some form of ideas there that Paul was suggesting. But Michael wants to really know when are we going to find out about some actual factual campaigning from National as opposed to just political ideology from National about this recovery and keeping the government to account?
Well, look, we'll be outlining our plans. I mean, obviously, it's a very fast-moving situation, but if you can look at it in three sort of phases. First one, got to get out of lockdown as fast as we can. And that means doing the stuff that we need to do around tracing and testing and being focused on that. Second, once we're out of lockdown, there will be a need for some sort of stimulus to get the economy moving again. And instinctively, we'd be looking at trying to reduce the tax burden for a short period of time to get people back and moving. Then that third term is about doing what we need to do to grow the economy more rapidly. And we've already outlined and will continue to outline our firm belief in regulatory restraint and not piling on costs and difficulties. We also need to continue to invest in infrastructure. And the difference between us and the current government is that rather than just talking about infrastructure and announcing infrastructure, we actually did the infrastructure. And anybody who lives in the Waikato will see the roads that we built and the Waterview Tunnel and many other things. And then there's plenty of other things that we can talk about, and they'll be in great detail if we get a chance to get Parliament back, which would be nice, so that we can actually have some of the basics of democracy functioning.
I actually thought, lastly, before you go, how, with select committees obviously sitting, but cabinet and not so much, how much can get passed through quite quickly without us knowing over this time, with a very small handful of people actually running this country?
Well, look, I mean, they can't pass laws without Parliament, and so that'll force Parliament to have to come back soon, because they're going to need to pass some laws to get come up with all this money and various other things that they've done. So Parliament will be back before too long. It's just what sort of shape or form it is in, and I think it's absolutely critical at a time when massive decisions have been made that will affect New Zealanders for a very long period of time, that we have full accountability and some basic processes so that the opposition can function, that the press can do its job effectively, and that's really critical.
Thank you so much for taking your time to join us on what would have been a very busy day and a busy couple of weeks, I'm sure. National Party spokesman for finance, that's Paul Goldsmith.
This is Sarah's Country.